Yeah, thank you so much, David, for accepting my invitation. We were just talking about how I just kind of late one night on a whim sent him a message on Twitter and invited him to come and do a talk. So thanks a lot for taking me up on it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Really happy to have you here. There's been a ton of interest in your work. It's had a huge impact on me and on my life from reading it and really coming to terms with where we're headed. I think of it as a translation from a lot of the sort of academic and very dry scientific material to what the impacts are on our lives, or what are the human impacts, more of a human-focused narrative, so we can try to imagine what the world is going to be like in a few years. I guess my first question is just how did you come to this topic? How did you come to this issue? And what led you to, I guess first it was an article and then to write this book?
Yeah, the short answer is fear. I'm a journalist. I'm not an environmentalist. Lived my whole life in New York and like looking at nature, but never like gone on a hike. I'm not somebody who comes to this cause through that at all. But as a journalist, I'm somebody who's been interested in the sort of near future for most of my career and had always just been keeping an eye on, the news from the academy and, following things in some sort of curious corners of the internet who do make projections about the future. And starting in 2016, I was just seeing, first of all, a lot more coverage of climate. And then secondly, coverage that was news from climate that was much scarier than I had seen before, or that I saw being written about in the places that, as a magazine journalist, I think of as competitors to me. So the newspapers I read, the magazines I read, the TV news programs I watch, and it seemed to me like we had sort of been systematically underplaying just how scary, just how all-encompassing, and just how all-touching this threat really was. So I often talk about this sort of, I woke up out of a delusion, which was a three-part delusion. And I think it's a three-part delusion that a lot of people have. One is about the speed of change. I was raised to believe that climate change was quite slow, happening on a timescale of decades, probably centuries. James Hansen, who's one of the most outspoken kind of alarmist climate scientists out there, wrote his book for a general audience and called it Storms of My Grandchildren. This is like the basic message of when we should be expecting. 2 generations away or something. Down the line, yeah. But half of all the emissions that we've produced in the entire history of humanity from the burning of fossil fuels have come in the last 30 years. So that means that it's happened in my lifetime. That's those 30 years, that's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established its IPCC body. So we've done all that damage, half of all the damage we've ever done, knowing full well what we were doing and moving ahead with this suicidal program anyway. And then the second part of the delusion was about scope. I thought, okay, understand sea level, but if I live away from the coast, I'll be safe. The more you know about all of the climate impacts that are out there, from economic impacts, which could reduce global GDP by 30% compared to where it would be without climate change by 2100. It's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression. It'll be permanent. Could inflict $600 trillion in climate damages, which is twice as much wealth as exists in the world today. To war, there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. So if we end up at 4 degrees, which is where we're headed by the end of the century, we could have twice as much war as we have today. Agriculture, where agricultural yields could be half as bountiful as they are today, we'd be using them to feed probably 50% more people. And really, on down the line, cognition goes down, public health, they're going to be mosquitoes that carry dengue and malaria. They used to be confined to the tropics. They'll be flying in Scandinavia and even as far north as the Arctic Circle in the next few decades. And the way that totally redraws the map of public health. But in general, this was not a story that you could conceptualize as happening elsewhere, no matter where you were. It was not something you could compartmentalize as being a matter of coastlines. It was the theater in which all of our lives were being conducted. And it sounds so naive to say, but it was a revelation to me. I was like, oh, right, I may live in New York, I may walk down these concrete streets and feel like I'm living in the modern world, which is separate from nature because we've conquered nature. But of course, all of us live within nature. We breathe air, we walk through sunlight, we eat food that is grown under these conditions. And the planet is already 1 degree warmer than it was during the pre-industrial average, which means that it's already hotter than it's ever been in all of human history. So everything that we know of as human life, the evolution of the human animal, the development of rudimentary agriculture, through that rudimentary civilization, through that modern civilization, everything we know about social interactions, biological behavior, political structures, cultural developments, all of that is the result of climate conditions, took place under climate conditions that no longer prevail. The question for all of us is how much of the civilization that we've brought with us to this point can endure under these new conditions, even as they continue to change further. So that's like the scope, which I think is all encompassing. And then the severity, I heard a lot about this level of warming, 2 degrees Celsius, which the scientists of the world call catastrophic, and the island nations of the world call genocide. And I heard a lot of scientists saying we need to do everything we can to avoid that level of warming, which is true, we should. But I think I, like a lot of people, got the impression from that this was basically a ceiling, a worst case scenario, 2 degrees. And in fact, practically speaking, I think it's about a best case scenario. If I could, as a dictator today, command the entire world's economy, its energy systems, its infrastructure, its transportation, I think we could probably avoid 2 degrees of warming. But since there's so many political and cultural obstacles in the way, I think practically speaking, there's no way that we can avoid 2 degrees. And just to keep in mind, at about 2.1 degrees, it's estimated that we will start the permanent and irreversible loss of all ice sheets in the Arctic and Antarctic, 2.1 degrees. That will eventually bring 260 feet of sea level rise. That'll happen over centuries, but it will be inevitable at that point. And I think, as I said earlier, we're on track for about 4 degrees. And so in doing this research myself and then in writing the book, I really wanted to think hard about that untold story, what life would be like at thresholds of warming between 2 degrees and 4 degrees, maybe a little bit north of that, because that's possible this century and likely in the following centuries, I'd say, if we don't change course dramatically. And that picture was quite horrifying, quite alarming, quite demanding. And I tried to write the book in that sort of, grab the reader by the collar spirit, because I would have wanted a few years ago, when I was someone who was aware, concerned, but ultimately complacent and deluded about how small a problem this was, I would have wanted someone to take me by the collar and yell at me and make me know just how fast it was happening, just how universal it was as a challenge, and just how bad it was going to get.
Right. Yeah, I think the opening paragraph goes through a lot of that list of delusions and denial. You call them fairy tales, this. And I think a lot of us, or myself included, have that same. There's a lot I identified with there. That it's like, okay, I've believed all these things. Maybe I still do in some ways. I sometimes find myself going back there in a way as wishful thinking, or maybe I hope that this is actually all not true and that this is really what's happening. So there's a lot there that I could identify with, and
I think it's true for all of us.
I think that I sort of have the impression that things were going well. Like they weren't going well, but they were like we were making progress, right? Like, see a lot more solar panels in my neighborhood. People have electric cars. Like maybe we'll just figure this out and muddle through it, and it'll be fine. And I think the speed and severity, the IPCC report hit a lot of us pretty hard, like coming to terms with that.
Yeah, I think even people who are really engaged in the subject now tend to think that we're moving in the right direction, but not fast enough. This is a quite conventional perspective.
Right.
But last year was the highest year for emissions ever on record.
Right.
Every year is higher than the last. When we're doing well, things are flat. We're not cutting our emissions globally. We're, in almost all cases, almost every year raising them. And we've made a lot of progress on renewable energy. That's true. Things are much, solar panels are much cheaper. Wind energy is much cheaper than anybody would have predicted even a decade ago. But we've responded to that basically just by growing our energy capacity rather than retiring dirty energy sources. And that means that we're actually in a worse place than we were 40 years ago, because not only has the ratio of clean energy to dirty energy not grown, we've simultaneously just added more dirty energy. And a lot of this story going forward is going to be the story of China. They've done incredible work investing in renewables. They've built huge solar plantations and wind farms, and remarkable. They sort of put us to shame in a certain way. On the other hand, they're also still opening coal plants. And that may sound like Chinese backwardness, but in fact, it's how we're behaving too as Westerners.
Right.
Even Western governments that are quite committed rhetorically to climate policy still find themselves sort of taking away with one hand what they're creating with the other.
Yeah, yeah. So the first section of the book is all these impacts, right? There you go through like different elements of our different aspects of ecological components, air quality, water scarcity, the oceans, things like that. And it is really emotionally challenging to get through. I've met people who haven't been able to complete it, or who kind of have the book and have looked through it, and then they're like, okay, I don't want to do it. But then you acknowledge that towards the end of that section, saying, okay, if you've made it this far, I forget how you say it, but something you're a very brave reader,
yeah.
Because any one of these chapters is panic attack inducing. For me, it was really like almost every paragraph. What was that like for you, researching all of this as it unfolded? Like, were there huge surprises? Were things much worse than you expected going into that? And what was your emotional reaction to this as you sort of did the research and it unfolded for you?
Well, I think I was unusually equipped because I was writing about it to process bad news, in the sense that I had a kind of a mercenary interest in bad news. Like, it was good news to me on some level to have bad news, because I was like, this works for the book. But also in the sense that I had something to do with it.
Right.
There was a very concrete thing that I was taking this terrifying information and making use of it in some public, presumably to some degree political way. And I still think of myself as a journalist and as a storyteller, and my main obligation is to showcase the truth of the science and what we know. But it's hard not to sit with this material and feel a little bit motivated as an activist too. Mm-hmm. And I did feel that it was really helpful emotionally to be able to have a project that I was working on. And I think that may sound like the privilege of a journalist, but in fact it's available to everyone, because political action is available to everyone. And if you feel terrified or depressed or angry by some report that you read in the paper about the state of climate change and the pathetic state of climate action, you can do something about that in the sense of being involved in advocacy and activism, trying to, even just voting for politicians who are really serious about this issue, but beyond that, holding them to account to those promises when they're in office and pushing them to make more ambitious ones, et cetera. Yeah. There is that path of engagement available to everyone, but I thought, myself especially, I was helped by having that in front of me. Mm-hmm. And as a journalist, we're all, to a certain degree, sort of sociopaths. We're interested in stories as stories, watching them unfold. Right. And I think emotionally, I had an unusual kind of prophylactic relationship to this material as I was using
detachment
it. Yeah. And I think a lot of people who've read the book don't have that, and it's been harder on them even than it was for me to write. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, I would say, to those who feel themselves like on the brink of despair or distress, who think maybe we should just be fatalistic about this and sort of give up. Mm-hmm. There are arguments about that being a wrong way of the wrong perspective on the science, which we can talk about if you're interested. But even just at an emotional level, the best antidote for despair is action, right. Is progress. And we now have the ability to really reshape the future of the planet by the actions we take now. And those actions will be driven by political engagement by individuals. So to the extent that you want to take care of yourself and your anxiety and fear about the climate, there are those tools available to each and every one of you.
Right. So one thing that I've been trying to do as I become more aware is have conversations and engage with people, and I find that a lot of people just are still living with these fairy tales and delusions. But I also find that often the conversation is can kind of just spiral downward into this pit of despair where it's just kind of like a huge bummer and a conversation ender where you kind of get to a certain point, you're like, okay, well, I guess that sucks, like what do you, how do you approach that? Do you try to do, so the other thing is like part of bringing you here was to achieve this too, right? As a way to get this message to other people. But do you have conversations with people? Do you try to engage with people? And how do you approach that? Like, do you have a
pep talk?
Yeah, pep talk or like a 5-minute pitch or something about like, here's what's going on and then here's what you can do. Maybe a little bit.
Well, the pep talk is basically this. When I talk about the really terrifying things that are possible, even likely, the biggest cities in South Asia and the Middle East becoming unlivable due to extreme heat by just 2050, hundreds of millions of climate refugees by that point, according to the UN. They say it's possible we could have 1 billion climate refugees by 2050, which is as many people as today live in North and South America combined. The economic effects that I talked about, the wildfires growing exponentially in California, in Scandinavia, the hurricanes, they're inventing new categories of hurricanes, and places are seeing what used to be called 500-year storms arrive every year. Houston has had 3 of them in the last 3 years. This is a storm that theoretically should have come once during the entire history of the colonization of the Americas, the building of a slave empire, the American Revolution, the ending of a slave empire in the Civil War, industrialization, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, September 11th, the financial crisis. We're talking about a storm that should have hit once during all that time, and Houston has had 3 of them in the last 3 years. We are living in unprecedented times, totally. And when you project forward, things get much, much scarier. But that fear is ultimately a reflection of our power over the climate. If we get to 4 degrees at the end of the century, and we're dealing with parts of the planet being hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once, we're dealing with 50% agricultural yields, we're dealing with twice as much war, it will be because of what we did to make those things happen. The climate system is not outside of our control. We are in control of it. The thing that's driving climate change is carbon emissions, and collectively, we are deciding how much carbon to put into the atmosphere. Now you can ask, who is the we in that sentence? Where does the responsibility lie? These are really important questions. Obviously, political responsibility is distributed unequally. Moral responsibility is distributed unequally. Also, climate impacts are distributed unequally, such that the global south is already being hit very hard by climate change and will be hit much harder in the decades ahead than people like all of us. And yet, we have our hands on those levers as a species. If you can get to a place where you think of this as, you conceive of this as a species-wide challenge, we are still the protagonist of that story, and we can decide, we can make choices to determine the future of the climate. That means wherever we are, no matter how hot it gets, no matter how much suffering there is, it will be up to us to determine the climate and the amount of suffering that the next decade will hold, and the next generation will hold, and the next century will hold. That challenge will be before us always, no matter how hot it gets. I think people have a tendency to think of climate change in binary terms. So they think, is it here yet? Is it not here yet? Are we screwed? Are we not screwed? Are we past the threshold of catastrophe? Are we not? Do we have a hope of avoiding that level of warming? But every tick upward of warming creates more suffering, no matter where on the temperature gauge we are. And every tick upward that we can avoid some of that suffering. That will be the case at 4 degrees, at 5 degrees. It'll be the case at 8 degrees. It'll be the case at 10 degrees if we get there. We'll be living with unprecedented, unconscionable suffering already, but we could even then bring about more suffering through more warming, or less suffering through less warming. Yeah. And always at every point, that will be up to us. So that to me, nothing is written in stone. Mm-hmm. This is a story we're all living, but we're also all writing. And that's basically my pep talk. If you're scared by what 4 degrees means, you should also be flattered by how much power that tells you you have about how you can change the world, how you can secure a livable, prosperous future for the generations to come. And if we end up at that point, we won't have anyone to blame but ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I met an engineer here who's working on a project around renewable energy, and asked him, sort of trying to get more efficiency out of it, and I asked him, so what do you think the impact is, best case scenario? And it was like a few percent. And I thought, well, that's a bummer, because I think we need to get to like 100%. But on the other hand, the way he translated is, I go, well, that could actually translate into huge numbers of lives being saved from just that reduced amount of suffering from that. So it's like every bit is worth it at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have a tendency to want a kind of silver bullet solution, but the problem is way too big and way too complicated to be solved through any one approach.
So I wanted you have a great chapter about technology, and he called it Church of Technology. And since we're at a technology company, arguably one of the biggest, we're inside the church. I wanted to ask you about that chapter, and I actually wanted to start with just I had some notes here about one of the sections where you're. Let's see, I have to skip ahead because we've been going around these different things. Okay. So you're recounting a memoir of Christina Nickel during the 2017 California wildfire season, where she's describing a conversation that she has with a family member that she's trying to convince him that it's a problem, that there's to be more concerned about climate change. And she writes, his response is, technology will take care of everything. If the Earth goes, we'll just live in spaceships. We'll have 3D printers to print our food. We'll be eating lab meat. One cow will feed us all. We'll just rearrange atoms to create water or oxygen. Elon Musk. Which is sort of funny. It sort of rings true a little bit. And I'm wondering, how do you counter that sentiment? Do you have a response to that?
Well, I actually have some sympathies for this worldview. I am a child of the 90s. I felt, even if I would have argued with you as a teenager in the 90s, if you told me that growth was reliable and that progress was inevitable, I also felt in some basic way that was my emotional orientation towards the world, that the future was going to bring more prosperity, more justice, and more fulfillment for the whole species. And I also feel like technology can do a lot. The problem is we don't have very much time. So the UN says to avert catastrophic warming, which I think is not possible, but they say that if we want to avert catastrophic warming,
1.5
to stay safely below 2 degrees, which would probably land us would probably mean somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Mm-hmm. That we need to have our global emissions by 2030.
Right.
Now, energy is the part of that problem that we think about probably most often, we hear most about, but it's actually the easiest one to solve because we basically already have a substitute. We have renewable energy. In many parts of the world, it's already cheaper than dirty energy. It will be cheaper in all of the world in relatively short order. But energy is, depending on how you count, about 35 or 40% of the problem. There are a lot of other pieces of the pie that are much trickier. Infrastructure, transportation, unless you can imagine the world completely voluntarily giving up air travel, we need to figure out a way to make planes fly without any emissions. Agriculture. We need to have new ways of raising beef and raising crops that don't produce carbon emissions. Industry. If we're really going to be running factories, how do we do that in a responsible way? All of these are thornier questions than the direct energy question. And because we're so much farther from technological solutions in each of those cases, that means that we need to build into those estimates a lot of time for R&D and then a lot of time for deployment. We've had the technology that we needed on solar, for instance, to completely replace our dirty energy sources for a quite long time. Now, it hasn't been economically feasible for a very long time, but it is now. But I don't think within the next 10 years, the world is going to entirely replace its dirty energy sources with solar energy and wind power, because that takes a lot of time to do. It takes political will, overcoming cultural local obstacles, NIMBYism, all that kind of thing. In parts of the world, it is considerably more complicated than it is even in the US, where market forces are quite strong. And if what you're counting on is some technological silver bullet, you have to imagine that it's going to be, if it hasn't been invented already, it's going to be invented very quickly, and then that it could be deployed globally in absolutely every sector of the modern world in the next 10 years. And I think in the tech industry, people often have a kind of misleading understanding of just how fast that kind of deployment can take place. And it took decades to put a cell phone in the hands of half of the world's population. And that was a totally additive technology. It wasn't replacing an existing technology, especially in parts of the developing world where they didn't even have telephone technology to begin with. And even if and we're still, well, I don't know what the penetration is, it's something like 65 or 70% of the world has phones today. This is decades after the cell phone was invented. And this has been one of the most encouraging stories of technological deployment that we've seen in human history.
We probably know, because we want to know how much headroom there is for selling Android phones. So
Yeah.
Somebody here probably knows.
And even the internet was invented decades ago. It still hasn't reached total penetration. And we're talking about remaking absolutely every aspect of modern life to take this UN goal seriously in the next decade.
Yeah.
The UN Secretary General says that would require a global World War II scale mobilization starting this year, 2019.
Yeah.
That we would need to be fighting climate change like we fought World War II starting this year. And I have a lot of faith in technology. I also have a lot of faith in markets. I think that these things can be productive, but I just don't think they're up to the task of that kind of change. We need much stronger policy direction to get us there. In part because, as I mentioned earlier, some of these things, there's just no hope we can get them done in 10 years. If it's going to take 40 or 50 years to develop economical zero-carbon airplanes, that means that we need to beat our targets on energy, for instance, much faster so that we can buy ourselves time to solve the trickier problems. And I think that we have we fall into a trap where we just think, oh, things are changing so fast, they can just change in this direction. But each of those changes is complicated, and there are millions of them to deploy on climate change if we're really hoping to get a kind of holistic, dramatic reduction, and in relatively short order to eliminate our carbon emissions entirely, which is what we need to do to stabilize climate at any temperature. Mm-hmm. So another thing I think people don't really understand, even if we're at 4 or 5 degrees, to stabilize the planet at that level of warming would require not just a reduction of emissions, but an elimination of them. We can't just get by having our carbon use. We have to have zero, and the UN says we need to do that by 2050, which is, again, given how long some of these projects take to unfold, really right around the corner.
Yeah, one thing I didn't know, just because I didn't study any of this at all in school, in computer programming and algorithms, but it's just that CO2 dissipates very slowly, right? So it's like up there for hundreds of years. I sort of had this impression of it's like an aerosol or something where it would dissipate over decades, but like there's stuff that's up there now could be there for, I don't know, 900 more years or something like that. Yeah, so
which means we also need to have technology to take it out of the atmosphere.
Right. So there's a couple things there. So the World War II style mobilization, I mean, it kind of gets back to the previous topic on awareness, where, I think one of the differences there was that everyone was aware that there was an army marching across Europe, and there was a tangible, visible threat that everyone was aware of. Pearl Harbor, horrific concentration camps and Holocaust. That was sort of in the news all the time. It was like on the headlines all the time. And I saw you just did an interview on this topic of media coverage, and kind of when I read your book, I'm sort of like, well, why isn't this in headlines all the time? Like, why aren't we talking about this every day? Like, why isn't it sort of treated as a much more urgent thing? It sounded like from the conversation that you had that some of that was different ways of thinking about how to approach the topic, right? Like intentionally not wanting to throw people into a panic for fear that would paralyze us and we would all just stick our heads in the sand and not know what to do.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different parts of that story. I think it sort of starts with every one of us as individuals, probably all of us, including me, who's like in the business of collecting this bad news. I still am not as excited to read really depressing, terrifying stories as I probably should be based on their importance. I think that's true throughout our society. It's also true at every level of our society. So at the individual level, at the kind of community level, at the political level, people are really just reluctant to look at really scary projections for the future and take seriously the idea that their lives could be meaningfully damaged by what's coming. But there's also a media component too, obviously. And, I work in this business, so I know it a little bit from the inside. And I think the problems there are complicated. They're multiple, but they begin with the fact that we want to publish stories that people read, and we found that certainly over a long period of time that climate stories were understood as noble, but were simply not engaging readers. I came to the subject thinking that that was a reflection of bad journalistic strategy and storytelling approaches. And one of the things that's been sort of gratifying about this whole experience, I wrote this story in 2017 that was explicitly about worst case scenarios, which was for a long time the most read story the New York Magazine had ever published. And then this book, which is, international bestseller or whatever. Well, when you know the numbers, this doesn't take all that much to do that. But still significantly more successful in that way of reaching readers than just about anything that had ever been published on this subject before. And I felt very much vindicated in taking a different approach, which is to say, to not be careful, but to be cinematic, to not defer to scientists' incredibly technical demands of how you'd want to communicate their findings, but be comfortable communicating in a common sense, conversational way about what it means. If extreme heat is going up by 70% in South Asia, that means one thing, but it's another thing to say, okay, in Calcutta, which has 15 million people, you're not going to be able to walk around outside in summer without risking heat stroke and maybe dying. And those are two ways of saying the same thing.
Right.
But scientists were so focused on being careful, and journalists who depended on them for access and for information reflected that caution back at them in their writing. That meant that nobody cared about the stories they wrote. And then there was this other sort of imposed inhibition, which you touched on, which was that scientists, journalists, and advocates all believed that there was this dramatic risk in scaring the public into apathy. And I just thought that was nonsense. I thought that was nonsense as someone who woke up to the problem, as I said earlier, out of fear myself. I suspected there were a lot of people like me, but also looking at the history of environmental advocacy. Rachel Carson, when she published Silent Spring, she was called hyperbolic and alarmist. The book led to the ban on DDT and the creation of the EPA. When we talk about the movement against nuclear proliferation or against drunk driving, these are movements that trafficked in fear and alarmism. And I felt very strongly that those tools should be used in this case. When you listen to the UN say the phrase, Secretary General say World War II scale mobilization, as you mentioned, this is not a threat that we looked at exclusively through a lens of hope and optimism. And so I felt there were all of these signals saying we should be at least using fear as part of our rhetorical toolkit when talking about this story. And I think the last year is a really strong illustration of exactly how effective that can be. I mean, my book has played a small role in it, but the UN put out a report last October, which I refer to as the Doomsday Report, was just studying the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming. And that was notable, not because the science was new, it was actually familiar to anyone who had followed it, but because the scientists who put it together in a much more urgent with a much more urgent alarmist approach than any equivalent body had ever used before. And especially in the way that they talked about it in the press in the immediate aftermath, they were really this is our time, we must take action now, or devastation awaits right around the corner. This would have been completely anathema to the scientific community a decade ago. In fact, it would have gotten a lot of those people sort of run out of the community. But we've seen over the last 9 months an unprecedented movement on climate action. We've seen climate protests sweeping across the West. Greta Thunberg and her climate strikes in Europe, she's gotten the EU president to commit to 1/4 of all EU spending being on climate going forward. Extinction Rebellion in the UK has gotten a conservative parliament to declare a climate emergency and commit to zero carbon by 2050, which is not as fast as I would want, but much, much, much faster than anybody was saying. Was
actually
even possible.
Something
totally
nothing, which is what we were doing.
And here in the U.S., we've got Sunrise and the Green New Deal. All of the politicians running for president and competing in a kind of arms race way to have the most ambitious climate plan possible. This was all unthinkable a year ago, and I don't think there's any question that it was produced by the alarmism and urgency of that IPCC report, which to me suggests, okay, so this is not a story that we can tell exclusively through alarmism, but alarmism obviously has an impact, can obviously be useful, and we also have to talk about what we can avoid and how we can go forward. Of course, we have to talk about justice elements as well, who's going to be hit harder, who's going to be hit less hard, et cetera. But to look away from the truly terrifying nature of the problem is politically ineffective and also, I think, dishonest. From a journalistic perspective, like, if the science is alarming, then it's only responsible to alarm people with it. It doesn't take hyperbole. It just takes straightforward presentation of the facts, which are terrifying.
Right. Well, I want to save time for questions. I just have one more, which is, are you working on any new projects? Is there a new book that you're thinking about on this topic or maybe a different topic?
The short answer is no. I mean, I'm trying to write shorter pieces here and there for New York. I did a cover story maybe not 2 months ago, about California wildfires, which it was a kind of, for me, a case study in one of the things I'm really worried about, which is normalization.
Yeah.
The California wildfires last year were the worst in history. The year before had been the worst in history. I talked to Eric Garcetti, the mayor of LA. He's 48 years old. The year he was born, 60,000 acres burned in California. The year he was elected mayor in 2013, it was 600,000, so a tenfold increase. In 2017, 4 years later, it was 1.2 million, so doubling in 4 years. And last year, 2018, it was 1.9 million. And he said to me, there's nothing we can do. There's no amount of firefighters we can hire, no amount of fire engines we can build, buy, no amount of brush we can clear that will stop this. The only thing that will stop this will be when the climate system, probably long after we're gone, settles into a more normal state. And yet, when I talked to people in California, they were all like, we've always had fires. And I said, yeah, but last year's in LA, it was twice as bad as anything that had ever hit LA before. And we're on this track where they're saying, conservative estimates, at least a doubling, probably a quadrupling of wildfire by mid-century. By the end of the century, there's responsible science that says it could be multiplied by 64 times, which means that we could have more than 3/4 of California burning every single year. Now, a lot of other scientists would say that science is irresponsible because at about the 2050 point, so much land will have been burned in California that we don't know what will grow back in place, and we can't make projections about what the future landscape of the state will be like. But in any event, all of these people were like, yeah, last year was a little worse than the years before, but look how beautiful it is here, and I'm sticking around. And I kept saying, I'm a New Yorker. I literally don't understand how you could be rebuilding in the face of all this. Yeah. Some of them building dream homes with their insurance money. I met a woman who had lived through 9 fires in Malibu, 9. And I mean, they would say to me, well, you had Sandy, right? And I said, yeah, fair point. But I think we all live with that impulse towards normalization. And that's one real risk. One of the real alarming, terrifying data points that I write about in the book, and I talk about a lot when I'm speaking with people about this issue, is there was a terrifying study that looked at the impact of air pollution just between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. So just that extra half degree of warming, just through the impact of air pollution, which isn't exactly an impact of climate change, but is produced by the same thing that produces climate change, the burning of fossil fuels. Just that half degree of warming, just through air pollution, the authors estimated we would kill 153 million additional people. And that's dying at the scale of 25 Holocausts.
Yeah.
And when I say that to audiences, I see their eyes open, I see their faces go gray, and I can tell everyone in this room thinking that's an unconscionable amount of death and suffering, and it's true, it is unconscionable. And we should do everything we can to avoid it. But 9 million people are dying every year already.
Yeah, it's already 9 million, yeah.
From air pollution, which means that we are already looking away from that suffering, not paying attention to it. And I suspect that is our likeliest future, that we live in a world that has considerably more suffering because of climate change, and we just find ways to look away from it. I hope that we can have a more empathic response, a more universal response, but my fear is that, as we're seeing already today, we retreat into narrower conception of self-interest, at the political level, but also at the individual level, and stop paying attention to the people elsewhere in the world who are really, truly suffering the most.
Well, Lee, I think we should open it up now for Q&A. I don't know if people have questions for David.
You touch on people's response of, well, I can go move to like Montana, or maybe my wealth will shield me one way or another. Do you have a more drawn out explanation as to why that's wrong?
Yeah, it builds on something I mentioned before, which is to stabilize the climate at any level requires us to entirely eliminate carbon from everything we do on this planet. And I mentioned the air travel issue. You and I can fly less. Everybody in this room can never fly again. Everybody at Google could never fly again. Everybody in the United States could never fly again. There's still going to be hundreds of millions of people who are interested in traveling in that way around the world. So what we need is a new technology to replace that plane that allows us to travel like that without producing carbon. And I think there's some way that could happen through private market forces, but ultimately, it needs to be achieved through research and development spending at a scale that only states can achieve. It needs to be policy. It needs to be, legislated that we not just develop those planes, but that airlines buy them and then fly them. And ultimately, that is true in every sector of this story. It's true of agriculture. You could eat a few less hamburgers. I could eat a few less hamburgers. We could totally go vegan, unless you think the entire world is going to give up red meat entirely. What we need is agricultural policy that insists that, for instance, cattle farmers graze their cows in ways that make their farms carbon sinks that absorb carbon rather than carbon sources, which is possible, or that they feed their cows seaweed, which reduce their methane emissions by as much as 95 or 99%. All of the significant paths forward can only be achieved at the policy level. And the impact of individual lifestyle choices, I think, is ultimately trivial compared to what politics can achieve. So I think it's valuable to do your part. It's good to live within your own values. It's also good to signal to other people that you're concerned, and to policymakers that you can live a kind of prosperous, fulfilling life and still be responsible. But unless you think that the entire world is going to voluntarily, without government action, without policy directive, remake every aspect of modern life so that it contains no carbon in the next 3 decades, then the solution has to be policy, which means to me that politics is the only thing of a scale significant enough to really achieve the kind of change that we need. It will draw on private sector solutions. It will draw on cultural changes for sure. But those changes and those innovations alone will simply not get us there. If we want to get all the way there, we need a political change, which means reorienting not just American politics. The US only accounts for 15% of all global emissions, but global politics around this issue, so that everything that we do is really focused on the question of reducing and ultimately, in relatively short order, eliminating carbon.
I kind of want to put this in even bleaker terms.
Yeah.
So we can sort of look at human history like through the lens of humans as a pestilence, so to speak, right? So it really sounds like we've evolved modern society, which led us to kind of explode our population. Now the host has a fever, is fighting us back. This is a problem in biology, right? Pestilent species explode in population, and then they eventually die off because they can't sustain themselves. And usually, dangerous epidemics are viruses that don't spread as quickly, because viruses that spread too quickly just die faster. So it feels like an evolutionary problem. The human species has to evolve in a way that is hard to comprehend. The things you're talking about require a level of sort of cooperation and behavior that has only been kind of idealized by humans. It's kind of like we need to build a very just, cooperative society very quickly in a way that has been imagined in the past, by religious leaders and by political leaders, but has never even been close to accomplished. And you know, okay, so I've kind of digressed now. But like, I don't know, like what is the precedent, either in historical terms or even in like biological terms, of like a species like us kind of fixing its behavior?
Well, it's a really complicated question. I would say I don't think of the pestilence as humanity. I think of the pestilence as fossil fuels. And that's a much shorter history. It's just a couple hundred years. And as I said earlier, you know, in a lot of ways we have replacements for those already. So the question then is, how do we put those substitutes into place and deploy them with maximum effectiveness? And that's a political question, as you point out. You know, the UN offers the World War II analogy. That's an example of societies really being focused on dramatic threat and taking necessary, if painful, action in very short amount of time. It also only lasted a few years and only took place in a few nations. Most of the world was not participating, or if they were participating, it was really just as the theater for other nations to be tramping through. I like to think of the post-World War II international order as an example, in the sense that many, many things went very, very wrong in that period of time. And yet we sort of quickly built a at least public understanding that, say, human rights were a inviolable feature of political life on this planet, and that we would do quite a bit to protect them. Now, we fought some wars that we probably wanted to fight anyway and just used the alibi of human rights to do it. But we developed a international order that was built on liberalization and the dignity of the individual. And that held for a number of decades. I don't think that that kind of loose network is sufficient to the task that we have before us with climate, but it points to just how dramatically and quickly even a global culture can reorient its values. You know, if you had said to someone in the 1920s in Europe that we would have a global political order in which wars would be fought over human rights, they would have laughed at you. And yet that we did that a lot in the Cold War. And again, like, not that all those wars were good things, but the degree to which we were able to commit ourselves to action on a principle that up until a decade or two before had been very, very marginal to the way that most political conduct was, most politics was conducted, I think should give us some hope. But I also think that, you know, there's a lot of reason for skepticism and despair and doubt. You know, if we've done all of this damage in the last 30 years, knowing everything that we were doing, and we've done nothing, we haven't changed course at all. In fact, we're making things worse every year. That's an indictment. It's also terrifying about the future. You know, the fact that we allow 9 million people to die every year from air pollution without addressing it, that's an indictment of us, and it's also terrifying about the future. And there are many, many more reasons for skepticism and despair, I think, than there are for hope and optimism on this. On the other hand, the science says it is all up to us. And while you may be worried that we muster sufficient response, I think it's important to keep in mind something I said earlier, which is that it's not a binary question. If we can manage to corral political will that will allow us to stay below 3 degrees as opposed to above 3 degrees, or stay below 4 degrees as opposed to stay below 4 degrees as opposed to above 4 degrees, those are victories. It's not just a matter of building an entirely new political order that is just and focused on this issue, or else we're doomed. It's a matter of degrees. And we can make progress by degree. That's really the only way that we ever do make progress. So I think question of whether one should be optimistic about our chances, for me, it's a matter of perspective. And I think if you're working off of the basis of what the world looks like today, the climate looks like today, there's basically no chance that we're going to be able to preserve this climate, which, as I said earlier, is already quite degraded. But if you're working off the assumption that we're on track now for 4.3 degrees this century, I think there's quite a lot that we can and will do to avoid that path, to bend that curve, and end up somewhere south of it. The question is how much south? And I sort of don't like making predictions there, but I think that all of those avenues are open to us if we choose to take them. And ultimately, we live in something like a representative democracy. We, at least within the boundaries of the U.S., we have the capacity to change those trajectories really ourselves through what we do politically.
Your book scared the crap out of me, and it had me thinking that given if we are to continue on this path, then the future will be so much worse that basically it was all consuming in my mind. It's like all I could think about, and it kind of changed my philosophy on what people should be activists for and what charities I should contribute to, and I basically thought that the only thing that matters is climate. Given the exponential suffering in the future. So has that kind of changed your perspective on where you think that people should be investing their energies? Like that's kind of the first one. The second one is like, do you have any other thoughts on how we can spread this message to deniers and people internationally, whether it's like, I was thinking, why are there no good movies on, what the future is going to be like, what the climate's going to be like in 2050? There aren't really any good books on it that I've been able to find other than the one that you mentioned towards the end of your book.
My own feeling is that climate is the all-encompassing story of our time. So no matter what you care about politically, if you care about wealth creation, if you care about income inequality, if you care about violence, if you care about famine, if you care about disease, if you care about gender equality, these are all things that are affected by climate change. And if we hope to make progress on any of them, we probably have to also simultaneously hope to make progress on climate. So personally, I'm where you are, which is that this is the meta-narrative of all of this stuff. That's not to say that every single person who's engaged in activism in more local ways should give that up and commit to climate. Obviously, there are a lot of crises and challenges that we face, and they all need their advocates. But I would hope that some emerging understanding in which the public sees all of these interconnected elements and sees that, say, like violence against women has a climate element, and migration has a climate element, and hunger as a climate element, and takes action as a result. I would hope that that sort of emerges over the next few years. I think it's starting to in some areas, but I don't think the sort of conventional wisdom is total enough yet. In terms of communicating to people who need to hear the message, I'm less worried about climate deniers than a lot of other people. Climate denial is mostly an American issue. It pops up elsewhere, but it's much more dramatic in the US than it is elsewhere in the world. And even here,
I read a story that said there's a correlation between the countries that are the highest emitters and the level of denial in those countries.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
Even in America, though, 73% of us believe in climate change, believe it's real, believe it's happening now. That means 27% don't, which is too much, but 26% believe that aliens live on planet Earth with us. That's not a community, that's not a population that we give veto power over our politics to. We shouldn't do that on climate either. And frankly, if 73% of Americans are concerned about this issue, that's a sufficient majority to get just about anything done. I think that there's a political challenge there, which is that one of the two parties, and to some degree the other party as well, have been captured by fossil fuel interests that have made inaction appealing to those leaders. And there's some reasons to think that may be changing in short order. But I also think that in terms of public understanding, the much bigger challenge is not denial, but complacency. And that's really the sort of direction I was trying to take the book in, which is not to convince people who didn't think climate change was real, but to convince people like I had been just a few years ago who knew it was real and knew it was concerned, to show those people just how big a deal it was, just how scary it was, and just how urgently it demanded action. And I think that we need to tell those stories much more regularly, much more widely. We need to tell them in our personal lives to the people we love, the people we know. We need to talk about climate a lot more. But you're totally right. I think we also need much more cultural production on this question. And I think we'll see it, because I do think that it is the theater in which all of our lives will unfold. My book is being sort of developed into a TV show, so I know a little bit about what's happening in Hollywood in like the competitive space. It may seem a little weird to say this is being developed into a TV show, but it is. And there's actually a lot of energy around this now. Like a lot of people are working on projects trying to explore the world transformed by warming. And novels, the same. The Overstory by Richard Powers won the Pulitzer Prize this year. It's certainly a climate conscious book. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. New York 2040, the Kim Stanley Robinson book, was a big deal a few years ago. We're going to see a lot more of that going forward because the world is waking up to just how dramatically transformed all of our lives will be by this force, and people respond to that in their own ways. People who are writers and movie makers and musicians respond to it by making those products. So I think we're inevitably going to see more of it, and hopefully that'll trigger only more awareness. But we'll see. It could also turn out to be it'll perform like a genre of entertainment rather than something that delivers a message of advocacy, which would be a mixed legacy, I guess.
We hear a lot about carbon credits, carbon offsets. Lyft is all rights are carbon free. The main question is it something fad, or are carbon offsets here to stay? And do you see a role of that in going forward in mitigating climate change?
I think if they were managed properly, they could be a useful tool for at least extending our deadlines. But the major studies that I've seen on the subject, looking at carbon offsets over the last decade or two, have shown that they're sort of like Ponzi schemes. Like, very rarely does the thing that you're buying actually have the impact that it's sold to you as having. Much of the reforestation that has been done in the name of carbon offsets have used the wrong kind of trees, which means that they're actually been carbon-wise rather than helpful carbon-wise. And so I think for it to play an important role, we need to have a much more sort of rigorous oversight over those projects and what they produce. I think that there are a lot of people on the environmental left who are really skeptical of carbon capture and storage because they see it as a way that fossil fuel companies can sort of continue to produce fuel. And I think there's some wisdom in that. I think we probably do need to retire these companies in relatively short order. On the other hand, if we really are able to deploy and do deploy technology or biological solutions that, say, mitigate 10 or 30% of the carbon damage that's being done by producing this energy, that's not a long-term solution, but it may help us. It may give us a little more time to develop the long-term solutions we need. So I think, in theory, they can be helpful, but they're not a solution on their own. And as we know them now, they've been of very limited use.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David. This was really
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thanks.